always wanted to do that. Good afternoon, and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Jennifer Keirn. I'm managing editor of Inside Business Magazine. I am really thrilled to be moderating today. It seems only fitting that on the morning of the first Republican debate, we're here to listen to a discussion that will likely, hopefully, be a major focal point in the election, and that's the national debt. Is it pure coincidence or strategic planning on the part of the City Club? I think probably strategic planning. Good job. The U.S. national debt is at post-war record highs, both in dollars and as a share of the economy. Not only has it grown from 35% of the gross domestic product in 2007, that's about the post-war average, to 74% today. It is projected to exceed the entire economy sometime in the 2030s. Debt right now per family stands at $105,000. Projections estimate by the end of this fiscal year, the debt will top $18 trillion. Economists and policymakers debate the potential impact of this debt. Some say it's crippling our economy, threatening to destroy it, and others say debt is just a function of the economy. It's money we owe ourselves, as economist Paul Krugman puts it. But what does that actually mean to the American people and to the economy as a whole? Given tonight's debate, what is the responsibility of the next president? He or she will have a tough job ahead of them. Our panelists today: Sandy Cutler is Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Eaton Corporation. Maya MacGuineas is President of the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. Both have a strong point of view on this. Both also serve on the campaign to fix the debt, described as a national, nonpartisan movement to put America on a better fiscal and economic path. And Sandy has previously spoken at the City Club on this topic, and you are on the CEO Fiscal Leadership Council of the Fix the Debt campaign, and Maya is the leader of that campaign. So welcome, and let's get started. So Maya, I want to start with you. The numbers that I just laid out are scary and incomprehensible to imagine, these enormous numbers. Do the numbers set the scene? If we're looking at the big picture, do those numbers accurately describe the problem that's ahead of us?
Scary and incomprehensible, probably, in many ways. Before I jump into the scary numbers, I keep saying this to Sandy, but thank you for coming, and I love Cleveland. This is my first trip to Cleveland, and this is just the nicest city. So I know. And I know you are the leaders of Cleveland, and many of you have done a lot of things like building the city, and it's beautiful. The weather yesterday, I don't know if that's normal, but so. And I was just mentioning that my 11-year-old son has told me he does not want to live. We live in Washington, D.C., and our summer place is New York City, because that's where we commute back and forth between them. And he just said, I'm done with big cities. I don't want to live here anymore. So I'm going to take him on a tour of good cities to live in. So we're coming to Cleveland first. So I mean this. This is a great city. So that's the good news. Then there's the debt. Yeah, so the numbers of where we are, it's been really interesting because the Fix the Debt campaign, which has really been a gratifying and very patriotic experience where many, many business leaders and former members of Congress and state and civic leaders have all become involved to try to push for a big deal to deal with these fiscal issues, because when you're trying to deal with the budget and make reforms, there are so many groups that will say, don't do this. You can fix the debt, but don't touch whatever you care about. Don't touch mine, don't touch this, and take all these things off the table. And we wanted to build a group of people that would talk about why it's so important to do all of the things we need to do to fix the debt. And we'll get into those specifics. But what has happened recently in Washington, the other good news aside from Cleveland, is that the economy has started to recover. And this has been great. Thank goodness we're coming out of what was a truly scary, very, very steep recession, almost depression. Things are getting better. And the upside of that on the fiscal front is that the federal deficit has come down. But what that has done is it has led to a new story. Instead of focusing on what the Congressional Budget Office or the head of the Federal Reserve, who was just here, or other experts in the field will tell you is a significant problem, the fact that we're on an unsustainable course and our debt is growing faster than the economy, people are saying, look, the deficit has come down by 2/3. Great, we don't have to deal with this problem anymore, because it's really difficult. Leaders in Washington of both parties gave it a shot. We can talk about what happened over the past years. There were a lot of almost deals where they tried to get it done, but they weren't able to really put in place the real reforms on the tax reform side and the entitlement reform side of the budget that would deal with this. And they're trying to give themselves a free pass and say it's not a real problem. But the fact is, the numbers that you just laid out are stark and very concerning. The fact that the debt is twice the historical average means it has a negative effect on growth. No recovery can really stick when you have high levels of debt. There are many, many studies showing that once debt gets too high, it dampens your growth potential. It has huge effects on the budget. The fastest growing part in our budget is going to be interest payments. That is not acceptable. That is a really bad way to spend and allocate your money, and it squeezes out all sorts of other things. It affects people in their daily lives, which is a very difficult thing to convey. I don't think many people sit at their kitchen table and say, oh my gosh, the debt is too high, other than me. It's probably why my son wants to move out of Washington, so he doesn't have to talk about this at the kitchen table every day. But it's not something that people understand, that it actually means our economy has grown slower than it otherwise would have, which translates into fewer jobs, and it translates into lower wages, and it puts all of us at risk. And so while there's so much insecurity going on in the economy, people are worried about what's immediately in front of them. The debt is a huge part of this. No economy can sort of thrive and be healthy in any sustained way when your debt is as high as ours is. And so the bottom line is the debt statistics are daunting. The promises we've made in the future are even more daunting, with the debt continuing to grow and no plan to get ahead of it. And what I'm sure we'll talk a lot about today is it's going to take policy choices, which we know what they are. They're not easy, but they're not impossible. And the sooner we make them, the easier they will be. And it's going to take real political leadership, which is why Fix the Debt is focusing on why we're here in Cleveland doing as much as possible, really hoping this will be a discussion in this debate and the next one. It's critically important that candidates talk about this during the campaign season. We're doing a lot in Iowa and New Hampshire and around the country. But the final thing I'll say right now is just that there seems to be a real fatigue on this issue in Washington. People in Washington have heard about it so much, and they've tried to do deals, and nothing happened. And the media is not covering it as much. It's not a front page issue. But what we're finding is when we talk to people in states and go out to business leaders and civic leaders and people who are familiar with what's going on in the economy, people are still really worried about it. And one of the most important things I think needs to happen is candidates need to hear that people care about this issue, and we need to find ways to encourage them to have an honest discussion. You all have a document we've done on many of the myths we think that we're going to hear during the campaign. We need to move away from kind of the easy promises and really tackle this and what the real issues are. So the debt numbers are scary. Yeah. The deficits come down, but the debt is still a tremendous challenge.
And I want to come back to those myths, but in the for now, Sandy, I want to know why you're on this stage. Why is this an issue that you've decided to get so involved in?
A lot of people ask me that question on many subjects, but let me first welcome you all here, and I want to welcome Maya too to Cleveland. One of the reasons that the whole coalition for a responsible federal budget has been so successful is Maya represents the single source of truth on numbers in Washington. She is absolutely nonpartisan, and as a result, both parties tend to seek her and her organization's counsel at a time when too much of economic data is spun one way or another. And so why are so many of us involved with the Fix the Debt issue? Let's just step back, talk about a couple fundamental issues. If we look at what the result of coming out of this very difficult liquidity-caused recession has been, it has already been 7 to 8 years of subpar economic growth. That didn't just simply happen. That happened because you've got problems in emerging nations with inflation that took off after stimulus programs, very high interest loads now being assessed in those countries. That growth has dropped. What's happened in the mature economies around the world is that they've each got enormous debt problems right now. And none of those countries are dealing with the fiscal side of issue to solve the long term. You don't solve it in 1 or 2 years, but to set the countries on a 10-year path to solve the debt problem, which then provides the buffer for the next economic problem. There's a theory of the game under our form of government where you don't have a balanced budget amendment at the federal level, is the federal government provides the cushion and the ability to stimulate an economy when it's in periods of weakness, a necessary and, in my mind, proper function of government. But When you go into a period of recovery, you're supposed to go into surplus, because that then allows you to rebuild the capacity to have that buffer for the times it might become more difficult. What we're doing right now is we're continuing to pile up more debt during a period of recovery. That absolutely promises that the next time we go through a cycle in this country, we won't have the firepower to step in to help the recovery. It will be even worse. And that's the reason that many of us are so involved with this. Is not just the current picture, because it never feels like a stress at the moment, but we are mortgaging the future of this country in a way that we have never done before, because we're taking the safety buffer away. And so it is important to get in, as Maya mentioned, and start to deal with these situations, that they are painful, they are difficult, this is hard work. The numbers aren't hard work, it's the trade-offs. And this becomes a series of trade-offs now. And the hard reality is we need both more revenue and less spending. So there's enough hurt to go around for everybody in this issue. And that really is the issue where we really need broad-based leadership. And I completely agree with Maya. Let's get this subject back in the center of the stage, and not simply accept answers from either party that this is what we don't want to do. We need to start to hear, what are we going to do? And again, to the people who say, gee, if you go into a period of pulling back on expenses, you will flatten or risk this fragile economic recovery we have, is no, not if you do this correctly and you do it over a 10-year time. We're not talking about trying to solve it in 1 or 2 years. We didn't get into this problem in 1 or 2 years, but we need to commit to the strategy that's going to get us back to building the economic buffer that assures that we have a future for this country.
And Maya, you've said that, you know, there's too much rhetoric. Spend less, tax more, whatever side people think, that there's these simplistic solutions. And so what is something that you think people should be talking about? I mean, you know, if somebody brings up the debt tonight, now 10 people on the, what did you say, 9 minutes each, most likely. Yeah. What do you want to hear them say, either now or in the future of the campaign, to get away from that rhetoric?
So let me acknowledge from their perspective that this is a really tricky issue to talk about for any of the candidates, because if politics weren't what it is, I would say, well, I want every candidate to put forth a plan for how they would, and it's interesting, it used to be that balancing the budget was the goal, and it would be nice to get back to that at some point. I think that's probably a little bit far off. What I would like to see is a plan that would get our debt back to down where it traditionally has been. So first down to about 60% of GDP, and then back down to below 40% of GDP. It's not a bumper sticker, I know, it's not simple. It's a lot easier to talk about balancing the budget. But what I would like in an ideal world is for every candidate who's running for president to say, this is the kind of budget that I would put forth. These are my spending priorities. This is how I would pay for them. This is how I would close the gap. And I would also, and I do expect them to talk about this either way, like them to talk about how this issue in particular is going to take bipartisanship, because every one of these choices is hard, and you can't have one party do it in isolation, because one, they'll kind of get killed on it, and two, the other party will start talking about repealing it before it's even stuck. So it needs to be bipartisan, and it needs presidential leadership. This is not one that just kind of floats onto the agenda. And there's not going to be million-man marches on it. It's not going to be an outpouring of demand from voters. So you're going to need presidential leadership. But I think part of that leadership will be, how are you going to compromise? So if ideally you put forth a budget that you wanted to see, and then talk about how you're going to bring everybody to the table to talk about it. Now, the caveat is, anybody who put forth an honest budget of what they were going to do that would really fix the problem in a primary will get their head handed to them. And that is the toughest piece, which is, I don't think we're anywhere close to changing this country so that all of us are really willing to vote for the person who will raise our taxes the most and cut our spending the most. I do, but I think it is usually a strange process that I go through to pick who I'm going to vote for. So I think getting overly specific this early on actually hurts the issue. And so what I'm hoping for, realistically, given how politics works, is that there will be a very widespread acknowledgement that this is a real problem. So we'll go away from the don't worry, we'll grow our way out of this, or we can delay, that we'll start to talk about it as a real problem. And then I think some of the underlying issues that need to be acknowledged are that a lot of what's fueling this is good news. We're aging, we're living longer, but the aging of society is a huge piece of that. So we've heard some of the candidates talk about this specifically, but being willing to talk about, okay, if we're all living longer, we should think about something like raising the retirement age. And I should say our group doesn't support any specific policies. We'll support whatever deal people can come together for. But many candidates have brought up raising the retirement age, and it's a sensible thing to talk about, or the fact that healthcare costs are growing faster than the economy. That's another one of the big drivers. So if candidates start talking about the kinds of things they would do to reform healthcare costs to help control the growth of healthcare. And finally, I think you have to acknowledge that the way we raise revenue in this country, we need to raise revenue and we need to raise more revenue, but the way we raise it is very counterproductive and harms our competitiveness in a lot of ways. So I would want to hear that they were prioritizing tax reform and what they would look at to reform the tax code. So again, I want to encourage them to be as specific as they possibly can before there's a backlash, because the worst thing would be is if the candidates, the few who are the most courageous, then kind of get punished, especially in the primaries when things can be so vicious. But I think the single most important thing is across that board, if people acknowledge that this is a problem and that we're going to have to work on the kinds of solutions that will fix it.
Sandy, what's the counterpoint to this? I mentioned in the intro what Paul Krugman has had to say about this issue. The opponents to the point of view that you're putting forward, what are the opponents saying?
Well, I think you'll see in the document that my team circulated to you, there's 16 sort of myths about how to solve the budget. And you hear lots of different people say them. And I think the counterpoint to the counterpoint is to understand the actual facts. I think that document does a really good job of popping those balloons. I think the biggest counterpoint is it's just hard work. And Maya mentioned that we came close a year and a half ago. And it was really encouraging to see, and I give Maya's team a lot of the credit for bringing together Republicans and Democrats, members of the House and the Senate, in small working groups, always with equal representation from both parties, and really working this issue of finding common ground on individual elements of the budget compromise, because it will be a compromise. It has to be. And it got very, very close. But those people who got out front to Maya's position, and when it wasn't successful, they've gotten punished by their own parties. And so, I think the real key element for all of us, again, is don't buy the pablum that you hear on a number of these subjects. Go back to the numbers. Recognize not everyone is going to get everything that they want out of this process, because this is a democracy and there are lots of different voices, as they should be, and they all need to be represented in this process. But it is going to involve two things that the different parties don't like. One, more revenue. Republicans aren't going to like that much. And two, less spending. The Democrats aren't going to like that on some programs. And you're going to have to do both. You aren't going to get this done by just doing one. And if we can stay at the high principles, as Maya mentioned, and not get down into writing the legislation during the campaign, we've got a much better opportunity for people to campaign. And I agree with Maya. If we could hear from a presidential candidate that they feel the number one issue they got to deal with is they've got to fix the budget because it defines their ability to do everything else. And to put it in that perspective, the next president right now faces an increase of $7 trillion in the federal debt while they're in for those first 4 years. Think about that, $7 trillion. That's what's going to happen if there's no action. So you come roaring out of this time period with completely having erased the safety cushion, and you have to believe that in some time in the next 5 to 10 years, we'll have another recession. That will happen. And if we don't have that capacity to help people through that time period, to re-stimulate the economy, to provide that safety cushion, it'll be far more difficult than what we've gone through before.
Just in a first term, $7 trillion
I think
just
it's
in
the
a first term.
Yes.
Oh no, sorry, in both terms, in 8 years.
2 terms, 8 years,
excuse me.
Yeah, because it's a little bit under $1 trillion a year you pile up. So,
Wow. If nothing is done.
Right.
Can I make one comment on that Krugman question also, because I get a lot of this. So many of my friends are avid Krugman readers. And when he first took his first 2 or 3 shots at me, which was a little, I had never been used to being sort of beat up in the press by somebody, and he's done it a couple times, and I now try to see it as a compliment.
Input.
Right, and he hasn't done it recently, and so I keep thinking, oh my God, until he takes another shot at me, I'll know that the issue's not back on the front page. But I get a lot of the questions from my friends who read what he's very smart and what he says. And the main point that he will argue is you don't need to worry about borrowing. We can keep on borrowing. And one, that it's more important to borrow now to fuel the economy. And two, that rates are so low, so it's a great time to borrow. So, and Sandy was talking about how during the different parts of the business cycle, you need to have different fiscal policies and borrow more or less. And I completely agree with that. And the economy is getting stronger now, so there's less of a case for borrowing. But when you borrow money for stimulus, you can also offset it with longer term reductions. And that's what we've always thought you should do, which is spend more now. When there was $1 trillion deficits in 2009, 2010, thank goodness there were. If there hadn't been, the economy would have been in much worse shape. But when we layered on new amounts of stimulus, that was also a time where we could have said, just throw out more policies. What if we change the way we calculate inflation? In this country, we overstate how we calculate inflation. President Obama at one point suggested adopting the chain CPI, which is considered the right way to calculate it. That would have saved a lot of money in the long term, but done nothing in the short term. So it works really well with the cycle. So I've always thought, what an incredible platform. You get to write for the New York Times twice a week. Instead of taking pot shots at people, put solutions out there. And the kinds of solutions that I think we should talk about are how you stimulate the economy and you generate savings in the longer term together, because that's what you want to do with the business cycle. And the other piece of it is you can't borrow forever. It's just too good to be true, right? Everything that's too good to be true when it comes to budgeting really is. There are some important things that we need to focus on, and that's the policy choices that we make need to grow the economy. So we can raise revenues by reforming the tax code while we reform the tax code, so it will be more pro-growth and raise revenues. You'd rather do that than hiking up tax rates and harming the economy. We can change the way we spend, so we shift some of the spending away from consumption towards investment. That will help grow the economy. But none of it is going to be magic. It's not going to happen on its own. And the point is, and I wouldn't say, we're Greece, we're going under any time in the immediate future. We're still the safe haven. We borrow in our own currency. We have a lot of advantages. But countries that do get hit by fiscal crises, when markets suddenly get worried about them and don't want to lend anymore, they, a few years before, thought they were doing great as well. Mm-hmm. And that's the concern I have, that this feels like, the rates haven't gone up. The markets aren't punishing us. Maybe we can just keep borrowing. That's true until it's not true anymore. And what really scares me about leaders who are kind of trying to put this off down the road is, if you believe you can put this off, at some point we'll have the very painful moment of reckoning. I mean, this will change. This issue will get addressed, and it will either be through leadership or crisis. And it's frightening to me that we are gambling with our economy and our country by not addressing this sooner and risking that crisis ultimately would be where we head.
So what's the call to action?
Well, if I could add one more comment real quickly. The explosive device in all of this is interest rates. We've all been living in this very expansive monetary policy with these prolonged, never seen before in modern time interest rates. Have that interest rate go up to 2 to 2.5%. And the debt service that will have to take place at the federal level is going to increase quite a bit. And what that's going to do is put even more pressure on this issue. And so some of the work Maya's team has done would indicate that by 2030, the total revenues collected by the government would be spent on Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, and debt. Nothing else is available. So all the other things that are done at the federal government level then disappear. And if that's not a rallying cry to the wonderful things in this country done around education, done around research, done around infrastructure, and the list goes on, all that comes off the table. Now, is that a choice that Americans are making as they think about this, or is it just sort of going on beyond the door that seems to be closed on this subject? So that's really the rallying cry, is each of us has a huge investment for ourselves and our children in leaving a fiscal and monetary system that works. And today we have very expansive monetary policy, appropriate. It needs to start to tighten. We have a fiscal policy which has been helpful in terms of what we were doing and stimulating, but it now starts to need to turn. And that's the encouraging thing that we have to really share with politicians and really demand on the principal levels, because I agree with Maya, it's pretty easy to commit political suicide right now by coming out with specific legislation before one is elected. But that doesn't change the necessity to declare it as one of your personal priorities, that you're going to get after it early in your administration, you're going to hire the kind of talent that really has the capability to get at this, and that you will practice bipartisanship in bringing the houses together to talk about this issue in the first year. And that's what we really want to start to hear about from our various different candidates from both parties.
I want to hear about the specific call to action. You get the opportunity to bend the ear of business leadership across the country. I want to know, what do you want business leaders to do? What do you want CEOs to do? And is there anything that the average American can do to have an impact on this issue?
I think the first is education. And for all of us who have the opportunity to work with a group of associates in our business or community activities, spend the time talking to them. Everybody's got some form of staff meeting or communication, and I'd ask, when's the last time you shared some information about the national debt and its implications with your employees? When's the last time you talked to them about the need to save more, because a number of these safety net programs don't look like they've got the running strength in them today that they looked like they had 30 years ago. When's the last time you talked about the fact that their average lifespan is up 15 years, and guess what? As a result, you need to save more for health care, and you need to do a better job of keeping yourself fit because you don't want to have this exploding health care package. Those are the kind of things where we can help people understand the implication it has on a daily basis. Have you used the analogy of your personal checkbook? When you talk to someone think about how you balance your own family budget or what you do within your company to adjust resources for revenues. Don't you think that's a principle that also applies at the federal government level? And help bring this to a point where people can understand, because 13 trillion is a figure that most of us don't identify with very well, but if we can identify with our monthly budget, it starts to make more sense. The economic education of America is really what we're talking about here. And it was interesting at a dinner Maya and I had last night for a number of leaders. It was interesting, somebody brought up the Ross Perot charts from the year 1990. And we all kind of laughed at the time. I can remember he looked like a hand grenade with ears, and he was standing up there with his with his two pieces. But he actually, that was one of the first time we heard people talk about economics, and people got the fact that the bars weren't crossing in the right place. And that's what we need to get back to, is to make this economic education a very complex subject. Let's make it a little bit more digestible for people and have people really start to get some fervor behind this subject. And that's what we're really all about.
Maya, how about you? What's the call to action?
Well, first off, it just reminds me of this great Ross Perot story I have. But so I called him at one point. I said, we need you back. So can I fly down to Texas and talk to you about it and try to get you more involved in this issue? Because we really do need somebody who will elevate the issue and get people caring about it again. I think the more you talk about it, the more people understand, but somebody needs to take that platform, and once people are in political office, they get more hesitant. Anyhow, I went down, and first thing I did was I leaned on what I thought was an armrest, but it turned out, I'm going to get this wrong, but they're these very fancy horse statues, which are like Remingtons or Remys or very, very fancy, not armrests. So that was the oh, sorry. I mean, his face blanched. I must be the only person who didn't know that. But he had the charts taped up on the wall. And so he showed me the hall where he had all these charts taped up on the wall, and it was fabulous. I took all these pictures with my phone, but it was long enough ago that it was like, a big flip phone, and it's dead, so I've lost the photos. But I did think it was such an important thing to have somebody who focused on the issue. My call to action for at all different levels is anybody who talks to candidates, and this is whether they come to you because you're a business leader and they want to raise money, or you're at a town hall with them, or you're in one of those places where you get to meet them. They're all over the place here. They need to hear that people care about this issue. That's the single most important thing, which is hearing from grassroots to the top leaders of the country that this issue matters. The business leaders is a really important part, having CEOs talk about how it affects their businesses and their employees, because members of Congress really care about what employees think about in companies. If people actually really want to get involved, and I'd love to make a pitch, anybody who cares about this issue, please just come on our website, join Fix the Debt, and if you want to write a personal note that you were here, I'll write you back. I would be thrilled. I mean, wow, great, an email from me. I know that's not exciting, but I will write you back about what we could do, how you could get involved, because we'd love to have people who are involved. But we have really strong chapters in different states, which are then when there's something that's going on and we need people to all reach out to your senators or your members of Congress, we can let you know what's going on and have people contact them. But we were talking with one of the chiefs of staff recently, and he just said, we're not hearing enough that people care about the debt. So the real thing is how we can engage influential people to let politicians know that they care about it. That's by far the call to action.
Okay, so we're going to go into questions and answers in just a moment. So start thinking about your questions. In the meanwhile, just have a couple of housekeeping items. This morning we're enjoying a conversation, obviously, on the national debt and the 2016 presidential campaign with Sandy Cutler, Chairman and CEO of Eaton Corporation, and Maya MacGuineas, President of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Like I said, begin organizing your questions for our speakers. As Dan said, please be brief and to the point. Don't grab the microphone away from Stephanie. If you're joining us via our webcast and would like to tweet a question, please tweet it to @TheCityClub. We welcome all of you here and those joining us via the web stream provided by our primary media partner, 90.3 WCPN, WVIZ PBS, 104.9 WCLV Idea Stream, or one of the many radio stations across the region and country that carry City Club programs. Television, radio, and web production and distribution is made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Also, as Dan mentioned, please be sure to join us on Tuesday, August 11th, as we welcome Ohio Treasurer Josh Mandel for a discussion on Ohio's online checkbook and new standards for government transparency. And for more information about upcoming or past forums, visit us online at cityclub.org. I should mention that our sponsor for this morning's forum is Falls Communications. Thanks for your generous support. Now it's time to return to our panel for the traditional City Club question and answer period. Holding the microphones are City Club member Elizabeth Falco, and over here, there you go, and Stephanie Jansky, Director of Programming. So first question, please.
Since we have the Republican debate tonight, I wanted to recall a Republican debate from the last cycle where the candidates were asked whether they would accept $10 in spending cuts for every $1 in revenue increases, and every single candidate said they would not. Yesterday, Senator Thune said there was no stomach on Capitol Hill for raising the gas tax, which hasn't been adjusted since 1993. Everybody's taken the Grover Norquist pledge. So what can be done to convince elected officials to actually increase revenues no matter what the level of spending cuts? And is there a role for the business community, which they listen to demand those kinds of minor revenue increases or revenue increases to offset the cuts in spending?
Why don't we both take a crack at it, Maya? Just from the business community, I think for the people who've been working on Fix the Debt, I think there is a recognition that, first let me just start on tax policy. We are in need of fundamental tax reform in the country. That actually provides an opportunity on this subject, because anytime you go through tax reform, there are going to be pluses and minuses from both parties' points of view, and you have the opportunity to do some give and take. So I'm actually fairly optimistic that if we could get into that process, we're going to solve a little bit of the stalemate that I won't do this, I won't do that. It's interesting if you step back and look at our tax policy vis-a-vis other countries, and I think often that's a way to help open people's thinking. Our gas tax is a fraction of what they do in Europe and in other areas. They use part of that gas tax for things like paying for medical costs and social medicine in other countries. That hasn't been our choice here, but we should understand the alternatives. They use issues such as a VAT tax, and if you actually take the U.S. corporate tax and take the corporate tax of most of the OECD nations and then add their VAT tax, those two are equal. So in other countries, they've made the decision to tax consumption, reduce tax on investment as a way to stimulate jobs. It's easier to talk about these events if you're up at the theory of the game versus now we're going to talk about limiting accelerated depreciation or LIFO or whatever else. You don't want to drop there, in my opinion, at this point in this debate. You want to get back to what is the type of system that we want to put in and what behaviors are we wanting to motivate through it. So I often think these 1 or 10 questions are great TV questions, but they're not really getting at the heart of the issue. What's the philosophy of how we want to run our budget, our revenue collection processes, and then how we want to go about the spending side? And so if I was a candidate too, I would not respond to that question, because I actually think it's not the constructive point of it at this point. What we really want to decide is what is the philosophy behind how we're going to collect revenues and what behaviors do we want to stimulate. And I think their candidates can speak to that and speak about their thoughts about creating investment opportunities or doing more work to really tackle consumption. And I think that's a much better place to be at this point. Maya?
So I'll make 3 points. The first is that I think the business community has been really helpful in being out there and saying, this problem has become so big, we're going to have to look at all parts of the budget. And within that community and all Fix the Debt, there's huge disagreements. I mean, we're a coalition of very progressive people, very conservative people, lots of people in between. Nobody has the exact same preference for what their ideal plan would look like. But there has been a widespread understanding that even if from a policy perspective, you'd like to have a spending cut only plan, for instance, from a political perspective, it's just not going to happen that way. And so to fight for the ideal for decades while you ruin the potential for your economy is not a smart strategy. The second point I would make is that the Grover Norquist tax pledge, I mean, I think this is very, very counterproductive, but I don't even understand this pledge. Because what the pledge says is, I promise not to raise taxes. It doesn't say, I promise not to increase spending. If you're really bold, and if you're very conservative, and you don't want to do any of this on the revenue side, which is a completely legitimate position, what that means is you're not going to increase spending, or that you're going to cut spending. it doesn't mean I'm just not going to pay for things. And so what the pledge does is it lets you off the hook, and it lets you say, I'm just going to deficit finance instead of raising taxes. And I think that's not a commitment to conservatism at all. We've seen a lot of periods where we have ramped up government spending and not paid for it. There's nothing conservative about that if that's where you're coming from. That's just fiscally irresponsible. So I think the pledge, honestly, anybody who takes that pledge should be challenged to say, are you saying you're going to bring spending down to meet where your revenues are, not are you not going to raise taxes? But one tool that we've used that I've found is helpful. So a lot of politicians come to DC, and I'm talking about this side. There's the other side too. Let me say there is plenty of kind of nonsense about not touching entitlements, promising to protect all of these programs, not touching $1 that you hear on the Democratic side, which I will happily kind of go into some of the myths there. But on the I wouldn't even take 10 to 1 side, we have a budget simulator it's on our website, on the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget's website, and that's a more simplified one. We also have a very detailed one. And what I do with a lot of politicians is we do it in town halls, but I've also given it to them and said privately, here you go. Here's all the budget options. Here's what you can do in healthcare. Here's what you can do in Social Security, on taxes, on defense, on domestic discretionary spending. Find a way that you could actually be satisfied that you could balance the budget or bring the debt down to a reasonable level without any revenues. Do it privately. No one has to see what you come up with. And politicians, in many cases, don't realize what it would take to get there solely on the spending side, because there's very few ways to really confront the trade-offs. I mean, think about it. For all of you who are, newspaper reading, highly involved, civically involved people, very few people actually know what it would entail to do this on one side of the budget or the other. So that private exercise has brought a lot of people back who have said, we just had a dinner for a bunch of congressmen the other night, and one of the Republicans said, I didn't know until I tried to do this without raising revenues that I couldn't get behind that level of spending cuts. So I think that level of education about what the trade-offs are is really helpful. It brings a lot more people to the table of why you need to look at all parts of the budget, because unfortunately the fiscal gap is now that large.
Well, you might talk about, because it's a great tool, how you're taking that tool across the country on an educational basis.
Well, one of the things we've wanted to do with, we are really bad at names at the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, where we run a budget simulator. Like, we need someone, if anyone's in PR and wants to give us some free help. Yes?
Right there.
So I'm guessing the budget simulator is not really that catchy, right? Anyhow, we're going to take the soon-to-be newly named budget simulator, and what we're doing is we run it. We run it with members of Congress. We run it in town hall meetings, and we are, over the next year and a half, going to put together, run it with groups of people, and it's really important to get a diverse group of people so that there's tension within the room, and people understand what the trade-offs are, and come up with all the solutions and capture what we're able to get from running this, and we're going to be able to build a budget. And it's going to be a citizen's budget. And we're going to be able to share it with the incoming administration and say, we spent a year and a half running this with all sorts of people across the country in diverse locations and places and views and politics. And here are the kinds of ideas that came out as the most popular. And it's not as though this is the budget plan that you have to adopt, but there are ways to fix it, and we want to be as constructive as possible. So it's one of the exercises I'm really excited about, is building a citizen's budget, or whatever you tell me it's going to be called. I was calling it the people's budget, and somebody said, that's a little communist, socialist sounding. So again, we'll name it what the right thing is, but it's a great, crowdsourcing. Crowdsourcing is a fabulous thing to get people's input on stuff, and there are now ways to do this, so we're going to do that with the budget.
Stephanie, you have a question back here?
What can we learn? What can we learn from the failure of the Simpson-Bowles legislation in 2010? It was so promising. We had 60% bipartisan support, with the public support of the president. And what can we learn going forward? How to make that work again? I mean, what have we learned from that?
Maya, you were dead center at ground zero, and you're best to answer that.
It's still, we spent a lot of time thinking about that, because the Simpson-Bowles plan was perhaps, and in the world of budgeting and fiscal issues, one of the most inspiring moments. It's what created the entire incentive and impetus to create Fix the Debt, because it was such a good plan. It was so well thought out. Many people kind of liked it and hadn't read the details. As you can imagine, I've read all the details, and in fact, a lot of my staff went and worked on the Simpson-Bowles Commission. with two really great national heroes, Al Simpson and Erskine Bowles, who led that commission. And the details of the plan are really well thought out. It's not just slop together and get the numbers to add up. There's really good policies in there. So from a policy perspective, it was one of the most exciting potential field moments. And then beyond that, I thought everything that needed to happen really started to fall in place, starting with all of these CEOs who stood up and got behind it, and not just stood up and got behind it, flew to Washington and talked to members of Congress and worked with us to build all these chapters in the states, and all the former members of Congress who came together. Within the Senate and the House, we had so many senators. Do people remember the Gang of Six? There was the Gang of Six, which was a remarkable group of senators, and we spent hours and hours and hours locked away coming up with the details on this. And they really had to work hard to, Tom Coburn and Dick Durbin don't normally spend a lot of time together working on entitlements and taxes. And what they brought to this was incredibly inspiring and impressive. And there are a couple things that I think fell short. The first one is leadership, the Senate leadership. We had in the House, John Boehner was terrific on this, and he and the president worked really well together on trying to come up with a deal. In the Senate, when it started to get close, the leadership really pulled back from it, and that was a problem. So one thing that we know is that the leadership has to be a huge part of it. I guess the conclusion I've come to is a very discouraging one, which is everything was actually in the right place for that to work, but for the fact that our political system is really pretty broken. And the reason I've come to this conclusion after kind of going through what could have happened differently, and if you had seen these senators, there were some rooms where I remember Judd Gregg, who's one of our co-chairs, came once and talked to almost the entire member of the Senate. We had a meeting about this, Simpson Bowles and the Gang of Six, what we had come up with. Pretty much close to every senator was there. I have never seen a more electrical, excited moment where all these members of the Senate were ready to do something because they haven't done anything in so long. Sorry. Well, that's true. But the political system, it's not working. And it's not working on all the other issues that have been teed up to see progress on, whether it's immigration reform or various things to put forth in the recovery. I don't even care what side you are on any of these issues. Nothing's getting done. So unfortunately, I thought, gosh, if we can just tweak this, and next time, we'll stay away from whatever issue, or we'll get these 20 more people. I think that there's going to either have to be political reform, and I don't know what that reform looks like, or there's going to have to be a real groundswell of people coming in saying that they're going to fix the fiscal issues, because we right now are stuck in a political situation where I don't think very much of anything can get done. I'd never seen an issue more poised to basically be done. The deal that Boehner and Obama worked on, which fell apart not once but twice, I still have this taped on my wall, which is their final offers. They were at yes. I mean, the differences between what they both agreed to were less than rounding errors. They had an agreement, and they still ended up walking away. The pressures, just by the way, the special interest group pressures on any politician, once it gets into specifics, is massive. And I know that lots of people will nod and say, this is very important to do. And then when it gets down to the details, there will be things that people don't like in that bill. Listen, my father protests me on Social Security all the time, saying, get your hands off my Social Security, Maya. He does support what I'm doing. But I understand that there are always going to be pieces of every deal that people are very uncomfortable about. And we all have to be willing to, instead of kind of empowering the groups that are saying, don't do that part and pull the deal apart, keep the eye on the big prize in this. But there's a lot that's going to have to change in Washington to get much of anything done. But
that big lesson that came out of that, and Maya and I and a lot of the other team members had a chance to talk about it, is it got so close. And so your question about how do you ensure we just don't get close the next time, and that's why we're ramping up the communications again now. The next opportunity is going to be with the next president of the United States. And whoever that man or woman is, we need to be sure this issue is in the number one spot. Not number 5 or 6. Because if it's in your number one spot, when you get close, you get the people together, you risk your position, but you go to get it done. If it's 5 or 6, it can kind of pass back. And that's why we're trying to get this elevated again. There's no way that we're going to get this kind of a difficult compromise done with the politics of America today unless it's the top priority of the chief executive officer. And so we've got a chance in this next election, whether you're Republican or Democrat or independent, to push this issue to the top of the list, and that's really what we're advocating.
No, thank you, because I was starting to go in my downward spiral of, God, why didn't we get Simpson Bowls done? Because it was such a great moment. But that's exactly right. It was really close. This is the next moment that we've had, which is the presidential election, and the only way that I think that this really has, it has to happen in the next 8 years because too much is going to go on for us to ignore it. But the only way that it's going to happen really productively is if we're able to put somebody in office who has already talked about it and emphasized the importance of it. So there's a real opportunity here, which is why we are back, gung-ho. We have to talk about this. We have to get this back in the papers, back in front of the candidates, because that can make a huge difference.
The gentleman's been waiting.
First of all, a cheap shot from a senior. Is your dad preparing to move in with you? The question is that you named a household number to which the budget was equated. Does this include the mandated entitlements which are legally established, as well as other entitlement programs? And if it does not, what is that number?
No, so it does not. So that household number reflects just the total debt that exists right now. If you also look at what's called the unfunded liabilities, and that's the promises that we've made to Social Security and Medicare beyond the revenues that are coming in, that number becomes about 4 times as large.
600,000.
No, we're talking about per family. Yes, so it will be about 4, 5, 600,000. I say off the cuff, but so those unfunded liabilities are about $80 trillion.
And what are we going to do about that? Why are we narrowing in only on the budget?
So that's a very important question, because I think so much of this boils down to the fact that the reason that we're in this problem is because of a short-termism mentality that has taken over throughout our economy. It's all about immediate gratification. It's all about consumption. We don't think about the long term. If you fix the budget in a Simpson Bowles-esque way, which would be to put in place a 10-year plan that's phased in gradually but deals with the real structural problems in the budget, the great news about that is that if you extend your budget window from 10 years to a longer period, which is something that we're pushing for, long-term budgeting, all of those unfunded liabilities would come down dramatically too. Because in the 10-year plan, you would have done things that would either control the growth of entitlement spending, looking at retirement age, how you calculate inflation, means testing, how you calculate benefits, and or increasing the financing for those programs, increasing the payroll taxes or other things that go to fund those programs. So if it were to bring the gap down in 10 years, most of these savings compound. When you're putting in place the right kinds of policy changes, they compound over time. Like that CPI one is perfect. It does a lot. That would actually bring down those unfunded liabilities tremendously. So any good 10-year plan, medium-term plan, would get us very close, if not where we need to be in terms of unfunded liabilities as well.
Why do you not use the $600,000?
Move on to the next question.
Because $13 trillion is so scary as it is. I mean, because one of the things is, we have people all the time who say, "Oh, you're trying to exaggerate the issue. You're trying to make it look worse than it is." You don't need to exaggerate this issue. It's really bad. And so there's many ways you can look at it, but anybody who looks at any amount of the numbers, and I would always just say, go look at the Congressional Budget Office. They have great, simple numbers. We know that the problem is bad, short, medium, and long term.
Hi. I'm very happy you guys both brought up Ross Perot. I've been telling everyone, 1992, he said the budget, unbalanced budget was going to kill our country, and we were $4 trillion in debt then. And so yesterday, Marco Rubio said this is the most predictable crisis in the history of the United States, and a balanced budget amendment must be passed. That's a very heavy lift. Do you see any chance at that, since every state has to balance their budget?
Yeah, it's a very convenient, we call it title, and I think often people interpret it to mean very different things. And I think it's become the short wording for, I think, a balanced budget makes sense. I think you're aware of some of the mechanics of passing a balanced budget amendment in the United States. We require the adoption of 38 states. I would guess we would spend multiple years working on that. Meanwhile, we're piling up $3 more trillion of debt. I think if you believe there is a role in the federal government in managing the economy through ups and downs, a balanced budget, a true balanced budget. Now you can define it, is it a balanced budget over 4 years, is it 5 years? It's not always just 1 year, so there are a lot of ways to do this. But it becomes a little bit more restrictive in terms of how you might manage through a very dramatic recession. It obviously works at the state levels in many people's opinions because you don't have this economic stimulus and you don't have a defense issue, two things that aren't dealt with at state levels. So I think the concepts are slightly different. I think often when the candidates are using balanced budget amendment or balanced budget principle, it may be a more general statement than what immediately some people interpret to be. That means every year the federal budget will be balanced on a true accrual basis. I suspect no one means that. And for business people, that's what we think about. But so I think it's a little different. I think it'll be a tough thing to get done, and I think we'd use up a lot of energy on it versus the trade-offs in the budget. Maya?
Yeah, I'm not opposed to it if it were structured in the right way, which means you should really be balancing a budget over a business cycle, not every year.
Right.
There need to be important release valves so that in case of emergency, you haven't tied your hands. It's true because the states balance their budget. The federal government has a really important role in fiscal policy during downturns. But I think if you structured one right, I do think kinds of budget restraints and budget process will help us get where we're going. But what I would hate to see is, one, it's an easy answer that doesn't talk at all about the policy trade-offs. So I'd hate to see people using that as an answer not to talk about how they would actually balance the budget. And if we were to actually go after it, my concern is it takes so long to go through all of the states that we wouldn't be doing what we need to be doing, which is actually coming up with a deal. The best way that we've ever seen budget process work is when you put in place a deal that gets you towards balance or a reasonable debt level, and then you put in place budget rules to keep it in track. So one of the best rules that we have in this country is simple, if we didn't ignore it all the time, pay as you go, which means any time the Congress is going to come up with a new plan for cutting taxes or raising spending, you need to offset that cost, either through other tax increases or spending cuts. So you still have room to change your budget, but you can't increase the deficit. That gets circumvented constantly. We added, I think it was $180 billion last year above and beyond what we were supposed to, just from decisions that Congress decided they didn't want to pay, new decisions Congress didn't want to pay for. So just having a pay-as-you-go rule would mean that we wouldn't make the situation worse. I'd put that in place while we were trying to put in place a budget deal, and then you pay as you go around that. You get a budget deal in place, and then you say you can't get off track without offsetting the costs.
We have time for one last question over here.
Pardon me, not getting up, I've got a bad leg. Sandy, you spoke here on another subject, gave me the idea of a two-step strategy. You spoke about how people can grow the economy by learning how to work, by delivering customer value and reducing the problems of an environment of employers being successful in growing the economy. So that empowering people so they can work every day to grow the economy, and then they focus on the things that make it difficult for employers to be successful, like government debt, regulation, tax. This is a two-part strategy. Your talk throughout, to me, is an idea that might be more successful.
Well, but I think, Chuck, it comes back to this fundamental. The country is going to do well if we can construct that partnership of public-private partnership where the government is fiscally responsible and provides the incentives that allow the economy to grow, people to get the kind of education they can, for us to have the competitive infrastructure that we want, international trade to participate in the growth around the world, and that buffering that occurs as you inevitably do go through economic cycles. On the business side, we've got the absolute responsibility to do our piece of that as well, which is to ensure we provide the resources that have the exciting careers for people to really discover how good they can be and to innovate and create real value. If either side of that party sets down, or if we interrupt them by what I'm going to call the exogenous event of a government crisis in terms of finance, think only about the sequester, and remember we go back to the sequester October 1 of this year because the budget deal expires. Not many people are talking about that, but these gigantic showdowns at the OK Corral, whether it was the budget crisis or the sequester, are very much an interruption in terms of business confidence. And you can look at capital spending in the country, in the 6 months before those gigantic showdowns, and it's dropped precipitously. And so this showdown mentality is not a good, we call it environment for all the things that you were referring to. That's why we really think, again, coming back to that, we need to address this as a long-term problem. It won't be solved in 1 year, but as Maya has said, committing to a long-term structure and philosophy for how we think about collecting revenues, how we're going to deal with the very important and difficult trade-offs on spending, that's how we create the environment for steady growth, for better employment, for all those things that we want here in this country. It's hard work, but it's only going to happen, again, as Maya said, if we put this on top of the agenda, and whether we have a Republican or a Democrat or independent president, we need he or she to be tackling this in year 1.
Good. Sandy, Maya, thank you for being here.
Thank you,
All the
Sandy.
fun.
That was really fun.
And to close, this morning we've been enjoying a City Club panel discussion on the national debt and the 2016 campaign. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And our forum is adjourned.
Well done.